Luigi's story. One of several I'll talk about in the long history of fasting. Interwoven are several other stories about fasting that involve monks, early medical uses, and a cautionary tale. Is this working okay?
It's too low. You're too far away from it.
Okay. Better?
Oh, so much better.
Okay.
Love it when you talk like that.
I'm just going down a little bit. Okay, is this it?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Okay, if I can just put it like. Okay, is that perfect?
Yeah.
So at any rate, as I was saying, interwoven are several other stories about fasting practices amongst monks, early medical uses, and then a cautionary tale about an experiment that took place in the Arizona deserts back in 1991 called Biosphere 2. Anyone ever hear of Biosphere 2? Good. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. But before opening for questions, I will talk about the various forms of fasting and uses of implanted therapies. So how many people have experienced fasting? I wasn't here to. So I'm amongst fellow fasters. And as I began to talk about the history of fasting, one of the things that I'd like for people to keep in mind is what is their relationship to fasting. You have positive or negative experiences in fasting. And feel free at any point if you want to ask a question. So, as probably since I'm speaking to a crowd of people that have already fasted, people know that it's one of the most ancient practices that we have that's aimed at cleansing the body, mind, and spirit of its demons, its toxins, whether they be emotional, physical, spiritual, or some combination. We're really very uncertain of its origins, and as I had asked in the initial questions, whether it begins as a spiritual practice. Some sources indicate that that is in fact its true origins, and that they date back to some 5,000 years ago amongst Vedic rituals and early Judaism. Other theories argue that fasting has an even earlier origin, that it evolved out of necessity of hunter-gatherers, and then later became a spiritual practice over thousands and thousands of years. During that time, humans developed the capacity to endure periods of food scarcity. And that led to adaptive behavior, and some people argue also changes at a cellular level. And the changes in the cellular level are things that involve adipose tissue. We'll talk about later in the presentation. So early humans adapted to periods of food scarcity, and this biological ability of being able to switch from feeding to fasting was later ritualized according to another theory. As a way of enhancing spiritual awareness, purifying the body, and of course, honoring deities. Fasting eventually became a practice used to cleanse the body and soul in nearly all religions. By the 5th century, the Greek physician Hippocrates recommended fasting to kill illness, believing that food consumption during sickness fed the illness itself. Today, of course, these practices are coming under more and more scrutiny as things like intermittent fasting or restriction have become very popular. When I think of fasting, because the primary forms of fasting I have done have been leading water, although I have had experience using, various foods or particular mixtures of herbs. And again, we'll get to that later in the presentation. What I want to begin with is kind of an unusual sort of image here. This, which is by the Dutch painter Utrecht. And it's one that will help us understand the work of Luigi Cornell. And I think that that name is probably foreign to most people, right? We've not heard of this character. And there's a spelling of the name will come up shortly. But at any rate, let me pull up the next slide. There's a picture of him and a picture of what his book eventually became translated. And he's a 17th century nobleman that had a very difficult time with food. He couldn't eat very much. And so he ended up on a quite restrictive diet. And I would like to now show you. I don't have all the foods that Luigi used because I'm a vegan. And he ate bread. Oh, sorry. This way. He ate bread, vegetable soup. Yeah, we'll do this. Egg yolk, small amounts of meat, veal, mutton, goat, poultry. And
Frustrated, didn't he?
he ate 12 ounces of food.
Wow.
You can see, I measured out 12 ounces. And he consumed 14 ounces of wine. And as you see from the various translations of the original title, that it was on the sober life and the temperate life, which seems to be kind of a contradiction. But he did talk about drinking wine that was young wine, whatever that might be. So I have a feeling that I think it was wine that was produced locally and didn't have perhaps as much of the content of alcohol. But he felt he had very weak digestive juices, and that somehow perhaps the wine helped in that regard. We can, but basically you can see that that's not very much food to eat. And he had, I think at various points, his discourses, at the age of 83, 86, 91, and 95. So he lived to be 103 years old. And we're talking 17th century. So when one thinks of caloric restriction, this is an example. But as we'll see, in today's world, caloric restriction is a different kind of fish, so to speak.
Was that a daily meal?
Sorry?
Was that a daily meal or
I can't quite hear what you said.
was it a daily?
Yes, yeah, that's what he ate during he ate 12 ounces of food and 14 ounces of wine, which you see in front of me. So at any rate, the reason I showed you, and here's an example of his taking, and then it says there in Latin, not so that I may eat, but so that I may live. And you can see the person that's serving him has escaped. And so I like to contrast, the first image, which I guess, in a sense, that represents kind of the diet of his peers. And I think what was happening at that time was that they were beginning to question the virtues of excess. Since the publication of Luigi's book, There are 30,000 books now that deal with diet, and it's become a $50 billion. But his is considered to be, the earliest and most important of the books on diet that published in Europe. And so, with this kind of tension, questioning the virtue of excess, comes the idea that perhaps diet and nutrition are important things to pay attention to. But the other thing I think that's important to see is that for Luigi, this was a pretty big ask of his peers who had diets that were quite a bit different from. So, but it made me wonder about what he might have thought about the people in his area of Italy, which was the Fulari area of Venice, what people who were monks and what their diet was like, what their fasting was like. And so I want to talk a little bit about that. So in a modified food fast, what happens biologically is a process that's called autophagy. And autophagy is a way of, that particular term means that it helps the cells clean and in a sense get rid of some of the ones that are no longer living. So, broadly, there are three forms of fasting. Here's the caloric restriction, the modified food fast, and only. And there are numerous types, of course, of modified food. There's juice fasts that use vegetables, fruit. There's ones that use grains or herbs. And now there are meals that apparently mimic fast, being used with people that have cancer. I can talk about that later. People like as well. So the modified food fast is an interesting one. And I think that it's one that also is what the monks use. I'm going to go to the next slide here. This is a very interesting book. And it shows that in early forms of Christianity, that fasting was seen as the reversal of sin. That basically people were atoning for the gluttony of that need. So the typical monk fast was 2 small loaves of biscuits of dry bread and a brine that was made of water and salt with a few drops of oil added to it. And then on Saturdays and Sundays, it was more relaxed so that people ate a bit more food during that time. Some monks ate a lot less often. There were monks and virgins who would only eat on Saturdays or Sundays. And one of the things that Shaw writes about in this particular book that we just passed here is that there was a saintly person called John the Hermit who stayed in prayer for 3 years and only ate the Eucharist, which was brought up in person. Okay, so I'm skipping ahead here. Oh, I wanted to mention one other thing, that the general advice that was given to monks about fasting, which I find very interesting. And it is as follows. In determining the proper intensity of the fast, the monk should weigh in the scales of the purity of his soul on the one side and his bodily strength on the other. Every monk, no matter what state of health and strength, attains to purity of heart and perfect virtue by restraining the lusts of the flesh, by taking care of his body, but not its desires. Fasting amongst the early monistic communities was also shaped by gender. And this is something that Shaw also points out in her excellent book. Virgin's physical regimen was not only altered internal processes of nutrition and sexuality, but was part of an overall effort to change the external presentation of their bodies and to diminish their sexual attractiveness. A Greek treatise offered the following advice or conclusion concerning fasting, and it goes as follows. Observe what fasting does. It heals disease, dries up bodily tumors, casts out demons, chases away wicked thoughts, makes the mind clearer and the heart pure, sanctifies the body, and places the person before the throne. But fasting is the light of angels, and the one who makes use of it is angelic. The early secular examples of the use of fasting for healing the body, of course, began with Hippocrates, who viewed fasting not only as didn't view it as a religious rite, but as a biological tool to assist the body's natural healing processes. And he promoted fasting as a therapeutic self-healing practice for various illnesses. Chinese physicians, like their Greek counterparts, also recognize the importance of fasting, a practice in helping the body heal. 10th century Chinese physicians used a modified food fast that was known as Bai Wu, which advocated avoiding the ingestion of grains. I find that fascinating, things that are going on in our culture right now. So people would be restrained from eating grains, and then they would be given, some combination of the herbs that you see on the screen, or some single herbs, depending on, what was going on with them. And a lot of this had to do with food and not so much with toxins from the environment. And these practices were also complemented by the use of moxibustion, which is the burning of mud on various points on the abdomen. Other examples of early methods of cleaning the bowel used irrigation of the colon and did not do it through herbs. And that dates back to Egyptian society, which apparently made quite a good use of colonic irrigation. And again, I think at that time, people were focused on doing this in order to help bad diets, basically, as opposed to doing it because there were environmental toxins. And the current belief, and the reason I'll say belief will become clearer as I continue with my presentation tonight, is that it was a means of, today we think that it's a means of getting rid of toxins. So some people include them as part of a fasting practice. However, inclusion is somewhat controversial. Let's see, I'm going to skip ahead. So the current viewpoint of fasting, and it's kind of a modern equivalent of the assessments that were made by people who looked at fasting from a spiritual perspective, come from what I consider to be sort of a non-related source, because it comes from a medical doctor by the name of Joel Furman. Joel Furman's functional doctors explains a little bit why he had more of a positive attitude concerning fasting. But he wrote in his book, Fasting and Eating for Health, fasting should not be used as a last resort. It should be employed as the first mode of treatment before a physician starts medication for almost any chronic condition. Fasting enables the body to repair and rejuvenate its own tissues by directly providing the conditions for recovery and removing the implements that curtail the body's recuperative powers. In the field of longevity, nothing else has as much solid scientific documentation to support it as fasting in a natural food-based diet. I'm convinced that periodic fasting will prolong life. I'm not speaking of frequent short fasts, a day or two, but of internal cleansing of 10 to 15 days, duration every 5 to 10 years.
Every
5 to 10 years, every 5 to 10 years. And there's another proponent of fasting that goes back quite a bit in time, but Dick Gregory was a really prominent advocate of fasting, and he goes into quite a bit of detail about it in this particular book, and was an important influence for me because he was one of the few people that mentioned that fasting was a way of resolving blood clots. And I, in fact, myself use fasting to resolve them. Happy to answer questions about that later on. At any rate, I do want to mention these two examples because there are things that really illustrate the diverse ways that fasting is now practiced in the modern world. And the first one I want to go to is the Buddhist monks of Japan. And this was included in the book. I don't know if people have ever read this book, but it's one by Natalie Goldberg called Long Quiet Highway. And she begins her book with a description of a practice by the marathon monks of Hiei, who go through grueling training before they begin their. And let me see, am I supposed to do another slide? Okay. The monks complete a 1,000-day running marathon, which lasts over a period of 7 years. They do this before they begin the fast. They begin running at 1:30 a.m. and they run from 18 to 25 miles per day, covering several of Mount Hiei's most treacherous slopes. And they don't take into consideration changes in the weather. They just do it year round. They wear white robes when they run rather than the traditional black because white is the color. There was always a chance of dying on the way. And because of that, they carry a sheathed knife and a rope to remind them to either disembowel or to hang themselves if they fail to complete the course and injure themselves. Those who are able to complete the 1,000-day marathon go on a 9-day fast without food, water, or sleep. This I don't know. At the end of 9 days, they're at the edge of death. Completely empty, they become extremely sensitive. They can hear ash fall from the incense sticks, and they can smell food miles and miles away. Their sight is vivid and clear, and after the fast, they come back into life, radiant with the vision. In contrast, the second example of a modern fast that I'd like to share with you comes from a New York Times article by Nellie Bowles. And she writes in the New York Times about a fast whose focus is sensory deprivation. And how to feel nothing in order to feel more later, a day of dopamine fasting in San Francisco. She describes the fast as follows. It's basically simple because it's a fasting every. The participant could not eat, they could not look at any screen, they could not listen to music, they could not exercise, they could not touch other body for any reasons, no work, no eye contact, no talking more than absence. The number of things to do is potentially endless. Throughout the day of the dopamine fast, the participants would wander slowly from room to room. They read, they put on more sweaters because fasting made them cold. Again, this is just a 1-day fast. They could go on walks, but walks were tricky because they had to avoid needing to ask for things like water or the bathroom. And Dr. Cameron Sefray, a startup investor and professor at the University of California, San Francisco's medical school, is a proponent of this type of fast. He says that he uses the technique in his clinical practice with clients, especially, he said, with tech workers and venture capitalists. No tests were conducted after the one-day dopamine fast to assess whether behavioral, psychological, or physiological effects. The same thing, we have nothing really that comes close to the Buddhist monks doing EA, the marathon monks. Unfortunately, there were no tests conducted of identifying physiological, psychological effects. But there was a grand experiment. And this is the one that I mentioned earlier about biosphere 2 that takes place in the Arizona desert. I have a couple more slides that show this covered an area of 5 miles. And there's the next slide that shows the breakdown of each of these areas. But they had like coastal fog desert, upper savanna, an ocean, a tropical rainforest, a kitchen. And this is the breakdown of the amount of square feet of the rainforest, the ocean with the coral reef, the mangrove wetlands, savanna, coastal fog area, the area where they grew things, and there was apparently a habitat where people probably slept. I'm not sure. And then the next one shows the crew, which was 4 men that participated locked inside for a period of 2 years. Okay. So they were completely cut off from the outside world because it was a kind of experiment in which they were trying to figure out, can we do this on another planet? Can we create an environment where people can live independently of anything? And so one of the things that's important to say in relationship to this is that the air was completely filtered, so it did not allow any toxins whatsoever to enter into space. That's not very important. Dr. Roy Walford was one of the team members, and he was a leading advocate of caloric restriction. And he suggested that they adopt a low-calorie diet, but one that was highly nutritious. So it consisted of fruits, vegetables, grains, legumes, and it was supplemented with small amounts of goat milk, goat meat, pork, chicken, fish, and eggs. And initially, they all thrived on this diet. And it was, I'd like to point out, considerably more than UHT. Their blood pressure dropped and their cholesterol pretty dramatically. This changed, though, when overcast skies and losses due to insects and pests reduced the food crop, forcing team members to further reduce their caloric intake. And as I mentioned, the food, the oxygen, all of the stuff was gluten-free. So one of the things that they did is they monitored the blood of all the participants. They did frequent blood tests. And during the first year, team members lost a lot of weight, about 17%, which meant that a person who weighs 148 pounds would be reduced to 140 pounds. To everyone's surprise, when they looked at the results of the blood test, they discovered that the rapid loss of body fat induced elevated levels of all kinds of pollutants. Persistent organic pollutants, such as DDE, which is a byproduct of DDT, and PCBs.
Wow.
These harmful toxins have increased 300%
Wow. In the blood.
in their blood.
They were coming out of the thing.
Yeah. Not so for Luigi, right? So, with subsequent intake of more food and weight gain, their toxicity declined, but very slowly over a period of 15 to 24 months. And here is a picture before and after of Dr. Wolf. When he went in and when he came out. So his conclusion was that the rapid loss of body fat is seen in so many diet regimens allows for the quick release of stored toxins into the blood, which clear slowly and may have harm. And so he was someone that really discouraged yo-yo dieting because it would repeat the process of being exposed to the toxins once the person lost the weight. He himself died of respiratory failure and complications from Lou Gehrig's disease at the age of 79. Although the causes of Lou Gehrig's disease are not completely known, Walford attributed his disease to the environmental problems that he suffered during his confinement in Glasgow. In contrast, Luigi's diet, one might argue, was even more restrictive. You see, he drank wine. I think some people did. Right? So he was not at that point apparently exposed to these sorts of toxins. Now, the people who had participated in the Biosphere 2 project, DDT had been around for at least 20 years. So it's like I say, this is the canary of the coal mine. Well, it's a long time ago. We know that the kinds of pollutants that we're experiencing are just growing in numbers. I wanted to also, show you a picture of Walford's book on caloric restriction. And there's this one of the participants wrote about their experience and that they were surprised at the amount of pollutants in their blood because the pollutants, the insecticides, did not get used for quite a bit of time. And here's a book that was done by his daughter and another writer that gives suggestions about caloric restriction. And then these are examples of some of the kind of pollutants that are not water soluble, so they ended up being stored in adipose tissues and cells. There's quite a few of them.
So,
Too fast. Yeah.
so where did those come from then? I mean, is the idea that they had been in the food sources there?
No, it didn't come from the food sources. It came from their diets prior
Oh,
to being in
Sending
their
fat
lives.
cells.
Oh, so it was being released.
One of the things about adipose tissue is that it sequesters toxins. And when you fast, depending on the type of fast you do, the toxins are released.
Oh, wow. I get it. Wow.
This is the conclusion from looking at this particular example. I mean, they were pretty astounded at the levels of toxins in the blood. It's like I say, they weren't getting it inside
Yeah.
of Biosphere 2. It came from just their diets over many, many years.
What about the plant life though?
Sorry?
What about the plant life inside? I mean, how would they get water and how would that?
It was all filtered. It was all that was filtered into this, into this sealed.
Can you talk a little bit more about the toxins?
Yes,
They're not water soluble, so can you talk a little bit more about, I guess I have a few questions on just that if they're not water soluble, that means they're obviously harder to release
they're hard to get rid of.
and they're hard to get rid of. So when you're fasting to get rid of toxins, this is really the part that I've been working on is how you safely decrease toxins, you know, so that you're like, I've lost 50 pounds over a long period.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so I'm just curious more about
Yeah, there.
overall the elimination of toxins.
That seems to be the critical question in relationship to fasting. And I may just cut to the chase here depending on time. Oh, this is Kennington State. Look at this. I'm going too slow. Well, okay, let me cut to the chase here because
It's 7:45. It's
quarter to 8. Okay.
We have until 8:30.
There's a couple of other things that I should mention. And there's a doctor, Michael Greger, that has a website called nutritionfacts.org. And he's done significant amounts of research on it. And I found a couple of things as I was preparing this talk that shocked me. And I'm going to narrate those, and then we'll go to your question in more detail. What he writes in his book, How Not to Die, is that since toxins like mercury stick around, women may want to avoid polluted fish consumption for a year before they get pregnant, in addition to the time period during their pregnancy. The reason they suggest a year before getting pregnant is that the half-life of mercury in the body is estimated to be about 2 months. And they did a research experiment where they fed participants 2 servings a week of tuna and other high mercury fish to push their mercury levels up, and it stopped, and slowly but surely the mercury levels came down. But he emphasized that mothers who are concerned about their exposure, exposing their children to mercury containing vaccines should consider that a single serving of fish a week during pregnancy exposes the infant with substantially more mercury than getting injected with 6 mercury containing vaccines. And then he says during the first half of pregnancy, it appears that mothers' blood levels of some pollutants may drop by nearly half, in part because their bodies pass toxins through the placenta into the fetus. And he says further that it may be the reason why breast milk concentrations of pollutants appear higher after the first pregnancy than in subsequent ones. This could explain why birth order was found to be a significant predictor of pollutant levels in young people. Basically, firstborn kids may get first dibs on mom's store of toxic waste, leaving less to the baby brother's existence. So yes, it's a big problem.
I'm wondering, have you heard about orcas and what's been happening with the orcas?
No.
So because they're at the top of the food chain, there's been an issue with, so I'm just because this is like related.
Yeah.
So orcas have been having problems with babies dying because they're at the top of the food chain and the ocean is so full of toxins at this point that they're getting all of those toxins, and so they're giving birth and their firstborn babies and sometimes secondborn babies are just dying because the toxin concentrations are so high, and also like in the breast milk as well. So it's becoming like a really big issue. So and it's so serious of an issue that
It's very serious.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. So basically, the ways that one gets rid of toxins while fasting, particularly on a water fast, is by simply eating animals or having colonic irrigation, having a colony. You know, the people that did this, there's kind of a long thing that I go into about what happened in the 30s with the hygiene movement. But basically during that time, the people who were naturopaths, trying to call attention to some of these issues, suggesting that people get coronas. And they had this idea that there was some kind of re-intoxication if you didn't use an enema or if you didn't get a corona. And that was unsubstantiated by medical authorities who claimed that it was just smoke. And they really demonized the practitioners that used it. And I mean, even today, if you ask a doctor about why, they'll say that it's dangerous. And they'll probably also discourage you from using animals. There isn't that much agreement even amongst practitioners about how often you should use it if you're fasting. And again, it kind of depends on the type of fast that you do, the duration of the fast, and so forth. Like if you're doing water only, I do really recommend that you would use, say, an animal perhaps several times a day. I have to kind of hurry up and see.
We have until 8:30.
Sorry.
We have until 8:30.
Oh, we have to wait 30. Oh,
Yeah.
okay. I'm sorry. I thought we were done at 8. Oh my goodness. Okay. I can back up and relax and find my place. So the hygiene movement basically used a number of different types of adjunctive therapies to detoxify fast. The first school was really adamant that you needed this, and the second school said that it was unnecessary. So there was a kind of debate that was raging within the community. And the doctors basically said that one's liver and kidneys should be able to handle toxicity. And this was their argument against using compliance. But as we saw, with people in biosphere, their livers and kidneys are really not enough to filter out the poisons or to neutralize them. And it seems to me that there's ample evidence that you can't really neutralize the toxins unless you have some way of getting them out of the body. And because there's so many of these toxins, and many of them are trade secrets. And so I think that initially medical authorities were confused about what toxins people that were fasting were referring to. And again, this is in the 30s. And when does DDT come into existence in terms of its widespread use? Anybody have an idea of that date? 1939. So there must have been, like a lot of pollutants in the 30s, but not the sort that developed after really widespread use of pesticides. Okay, So I think it's fair to say that we really lack a comprehensive theory of how toxins affect the body, and more importantly, like how to mitigate. Because people end up with cancer 20 years later, and the argument is we don't know what it costs to be. So I think the other thing that's really changed is how we look at adipose cells and adipose tissue. That we just used to think of them as storage things. But now we realize that they also have endocrine functions and that they have very complicated relationships to the toxins in the body. Latest studies show that adipose tissues and cells store a variety of toxins that, as I was pointing out, are not water soluble and accumulate in fatty tissue and resist degradation. This is particularly true of the persistent organic pollutants that we saw in biosphere 2. Adipose cells and tissues sequester a low-grade internal source of stored persistent organic pollutants, leading to continuous exposure of these toxins to other body tissues, again, seen in biosphere 2. The consequence of altered adipose tissue is an increase in inflammation and poisoning of blood. So current thinking is that the use of colonic irrigation, whether by enemas or colonics, are essential to water fasts and are essential if you're somebody that's really taking caloric restriction seriously. Yeah. You see the serious example. Because as you begin to lose weight, you're also going to start getting toxins. And if you don't keep up with that process, then you're simply yo-yo dieting because the body needs the fat in order to sequester the toxins so that it doesn't kill your organs, basically. So let's see.
Yeah. Oh. Do you mean to say that the body will like increase adipose tissue as a mitigation?
Correct.
Yeah.
That's what seems to be happening. Because, again, when we look at the example in Biosphere 2, one of the things they point out is that the issue with toxicity resolved over a 15 to 24 month period as people regain weight.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that that's part of the reason that diets fail is because people are not also getting rid of the toxicity. Mm-hmm. And that they need the all-important adipose cell and tissue to sequester the poison, sequester the toxins. And I think that in my years of fasting, I've kind of come to that conclusion where because I used to fast, not using hands, not getting hormones, thinking they were unimportant. And I had really changed my mind about that. There's another reason that fasting is an important thing. Again, as was pointed out by several of the doctors on the other side of the divide here. And that's because there's sentient cells that are called zombie cells that maintain very minimal biological activity, but continue to produce waste and don't really perform any useful function other than, again, contributing to toxicity, inflammation, and that they tend to really dysregulate the auto fabric. It's a hard one to say, but it's autophagy, so it dysregulates that process. And that we're finding that that's kind of a key finding in relationship to things like Alzheimer's, because the brain loses its ability to detoxify. So let's just quickly talk about some of the types of fasting and the phases. Okay, this is important. So some of the clinics that do fasting, there's one in Germany, there's I think one also in California. I don't know if California has the same process is the one in Germany. But they often will begin a fast with purging. And those are the ingredients of the purging form. I believe it suggests staying on the smaller side of the dosages of those salts. And it does remove purging. And one of the difficult things about fasting is how to prepare for it. And this is like one aspect of the preparation process. So for example, if I'm a person that's an omnivore, and I'm thinking, oh, I'm going to fast for a week, so I'm going to eat a steak and just really chow down before I fast. Bad idea. Bad idea. If on the other hand, you go on a plant-based diet, you get a colonic, you start your fast, much easier, much less symptoms. So again, if you're doing something like intermittent fasting, I think that's not something that's probably quite as important in relationship to doing something to cleanse yourself of toxins. Although it's probably not a bad idea. And it sort of depends on what kind of diet are you going into the fast with. What's your diet been like over the last 20 years? If there's someone that has consumed a lot of things that are potentially high in toxins. And again, the toxins tend to get really concentrated in fleshes. And so eating plant-based means you're getting exposure to toxins, but in smaller amounts. And it may be possible.
Did you speak already about the benefit of intermittent or modified fasting?
Not quite yet. No. Not sure where that is.
So is that kind of like the cleanse that you do for a colonoscopy?
It's similar.
Yeah, it looks like it.
Yeah, it's very similar, right? They may use a little bit of different chemistry. But basically, the Fasting Institute in Germany pretty much gives this to people the first day. So that, because it means that you get to autolysis more quickly. Because autolysis is when the body runs out of glucose and shifts to ketones. And the ketones are the things that power the body and nourish the brain. And that's the point at which the toxins start to be released. And one thing I made a slide in this. Some of the common symptoms of detoxing are headaches, fatigue, bad breath, skin eruptions, mood swings. All of those things get reduced if you do an enema or you get it from. Some of those are just saying your body's really detoxing. If you have dizziness, or you faint, or you have palpitations, confusion, disorientation, severe weight weakness, or you start vomiting, those are not signs of detox. Those are stop your fast. So I did have this particular book, which has a number of different types of internal baths. And this is one of the best sources. Different herbs to use in different seasons to mix with water for benefits. This is a particular formula for a fast that's designed to cleanse the liver. And again, the liver is the major organ that detoxes the body. This comes from Hazel Parcells, who was a naturopath in the Southwest. She, by the way, lived to be 106. And I have used this particular fast multiple times. and ran into problems getting the hormone. So I appealed to Matthew Wood, who helped me figure out the proportions, because I knew all the herbs and just didn't know the proportions. So I thank him for helping me with this. I'm sure with the rest of you, if you want to do this particular type of fast, and I'm willing to give people additional information.
And those are just the raw herbs and, decoction and water.
Yes. Basically, what you would do is once all those are mixed up, then there are certain proportions that are mixing with water. And you take like 4 ounces of it, 4 ounces of tomato juice. And that alternates with grapefruit juice. And then there is something else that she adds, which is a gallbladder. And that's done on the third night with half a cup of olive oil and half a cup of grapefruit juice. Here's one. Grapefruit juice, yeah. And it sounds pretty awful, but when you have that much to eat in 2 days, you'd be surprised. So that's her formula, and there is instructions that go along. So I'm not sure if I'm going to handle. I could maybe put it up somewhere if people have an interest in doing this, and maybe I could just pass it around. Sheet of paper. If you give her email address, I'll send it.
That'd be great.
We need to use that. Anyhow, just put my email address and I'll send you the protocol. So basically, I have used this. I ended up in a situation where I had a terrible digestive disorder that I didn't understand where it was coming from. And I fortunately was able to connect with someone that knew Hazel. And she basically said, "Oh, you have gallbladders." And I thought, "Oh my God, it's like, here's the formula." And so I did it. It's very amazing. It changed my life. So I have pretty much repeated it yearly for many years. I'm also torn my meniscus and saw several doctors and complained about capping. And I was like, I just didn't hear what I was saying. I did an MRI just of my knee. They didn't do an ultrasound of muscle at all. And I appealed to my doctor and said, I have this happening. It's probably a DVT, deep vein thrombosis, blood. And so he said, you should go to the hospital. Ultrasound, and sure enough, I've been walking around with that blood clot more than a month. In fact, I'm surprised it didn't move because of all the things I was doing to my knee to try to heal me. So it began a very strange odyssey for me because it put me immediately on blood thinners. But I was on the new form of blood thinner because I asked him, well, can I fast? He said, yeah, you can fast with this blood thinner, no problem. So I did a series of fasts and I ended up at the a very specialized place that looks at climate disorders. And I tried to explain to them what I was doing. When I looked at their notes, they said that I was doing a ritual fast to rid myself of my blood. That's interesting. And they also denied me another ultrasound. So I gave this person all zeros. Unfortunately, I was getting another appointment and I explained what I was doing. And it explained that it was in their literature. There's nothing ritual about what I was doing. Sorry, I'm keep pushing here. And so they gave me one more ultrasound. and it was clean. The blood clot. Now, that was a very long fast of 17 days.
Ooh.
And I had dropped 23 pounds in that time period. But I didn't get sick. I got well. So, but I did things to try to stay ahead of the process.
Were you doing enemas?
So, yes,
You were-
and colonics.
Okay.
And colonics. I'm sorry in some ways that I don't share the stage with someone that has knowledge in colonic litigation. It's a pretty interesting subject in and of itself. So one of the things that Hazel recommends actually is doing an enema with blackstrap molasses. I can't say that I recommend that highly. Partly because it seems like there's also kind of an epidemic of candida. And if you have candida and you use that, you'll be miserable.
Yeah.
If you use what?
If you use blackstrap molasses. Blackstrap molasses because it has sugar, but it's a very high antioxidant thing, and it has significant amounts of magnesium, which help dilate the gallbladder. And so that's part of the reason that she recommends using them, particularly if you're doing the gallbladder flush.
There be a risk of too much iron? I mean, maybe you wouldn't be using enough.
It's a tablespoon in the quarter.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah. But over the 4 or 5 days that you use them.
Sal, there's another question. What do you, I've heard of coffee.
Yes, I was just going to talk about that. Good, we brought that up. I almost said it now. So for that, that's Max Gerson. And what he recommends is that there's a particular formula for the coffee enema, which is 3 rounded tablespoons per quart of water. You boil it for 3 minutes on cover, then you simmer it for 15, and then you have to hold the solution for 12 minutes. And his research indicates that it's one of the ways of helping the body clear the blood of toxins because of the chemistry that's involved in coffee. And I think his daughter, Charlotte, has a book called Healing the Gerson Way, Defeating Cancer and Other Chronic Illnesses. And that book goes into considerably more detail about the use of that particular.
One of my questions is, I don't know, what is used in those solutions? Like for enemas and colonics, what is used in solutions?
Just water.
So how is that pulling out oil soluble molecules?
Well, there's the body's digesting stuff, and it's dumping it into the colon.
You know what's stool, though, shouldn't there's so much new microbial cells that are making it the stool, like why are you not passing like that?
Well, one of the things that happens when you stop eating is you stop producing stool. And so one of the other things that usually accompanies a water fast is a certain amount of laxative. And that's something that was built into Hazel Parcells' fast, is that she would recommend taking laxatives at various points in the fast. And so that keeps things moving. And that's the primary thing, is that you really need to keep things moving out of here, so to speak. And the enema is a good way, but you also need to use some kind of laxative. Yeah.
One comment and one question. One comment and one question. So a type 1 diabetic would do a fast to try to go into ketolysis because that would put them into
Ketoacidosis.
That's right. So that would be life-threatening.
Michael,
Okay, one other thing. And then can you please talk about chelating supplements to draw out toxins? Does that exist or do you recommend that?
okay, I'll do both questions. It's odd because Gregory recommends fasting for diabetics. And I sent him to his website, nutritionfacts.org.
There's type 1 and type 2.
Sorry?
There's type 1 and type 2.
Yes, I'm talking to him too.
I'm talking about type 1.
Well, type 1 is a whole different,
Yeah.
that's a whole different question. And I have not had experience with people
I have
using
type 1.
fast.
So that's why
You
I'm
know,
aware of that.
yeah. So you would have to use other methods. Yeah. In terms of the second question, he has something on the website about the value of using brewer's yeast for people who have type 2 diabetes. And if you take a chelated supplement of chromium, it has no effect. But if you use brewer's yeast, it does. So there's something about supplements that isolate and chelate that we're not sure exactly if it work or not. That's the conclusion I've drawn now. Myself giving that kind of supplement to clients and not seeing much results for people that had type 2. But when I switched them to brewer's yeast, there was quite a bit of change. And he has that, documented on the website because he saw a paper that was published back in the 1860s about using 2 tablespoons of brewer's yeast for people that had type 2. And he wondered whether there were any current studies, and he found that there were. And he recognized it's a half teaspoon a day, people that have type 2. But in terms of type 1, it's a whole different ballgame, so to speak. So other questions? Yeah.
I know I've heard people talk about using other sort of like toxin binders like charcoal, spirulina, chlorella. Can you speak to that at all?
I've not used them myself. And it seems like charcoal would be a good bet. With the spirulina, I'm not sure. I don't know that there's any particular evidence about the use of those things, but Gregor could have something on his website because he tends to be pretty comprehensive in terms of, covering questions and issues related to whether supplements work or not. So, let me give you this.
So, one thing I'm curious about is I've heard that fasting can work differently in bodies that menstruate.
Yes.
And that it can be like, I know for myself, I've never gone a full day without eating because I just feel really awful when eating, like it just doesn't. So I'm just curious if you find that there is a difference and if there's different protocol and ways to safely do that. Because I know also like our hormones are impacted and, I don't know, just kind of looking at how that might work differently.
You raise a great question. In fact, there's somebody that now has written a whole book on the subject. It's called Fasting Like a Girl. So I encourage you to look into it. I have just kind of got a copy of it and haven't finished reading it. But it addresses some of the concerns about what do you do if you're menstruating? Is that a good time to fast or not? How do you, time fasting with menstruation? So I will send you to that source if the new author escapes me, but I'm sure they're not going to find many books with that type. Fasting like a girl.
I was wondering about, I think my voice might be, thank you.
Mine's terrible.
I can be too loud sometimes. I was wondering about the other forms of detox that I've used have been like ionizer, foot ionizer bath during fast, or I mean, I was recommended to use red light, but I didn't try that. I just wasn't interested in the machines right now. But what was the other form I'm gonna ask you? The ionized foot bath,
Ionized
which
foot bath, yeah.
seemed to, I seem to have some success with that. Oh, splats, that's the other, what nature really.
Yeah,
So any ways to use those.
Like doing saunas or sitting and steaming, that sort of thing. From what I've seen, the evidence is not conclusive. But again, this is like, how do you do a study? How do you do a study of any of this stuff at this point? Seems to me to be very complex, right? Because there's too many factors. But we look at societies that utilize saunas and see what you can glean from those cultures.
Can I just follow up on the cool word that you said about the cellular cleaning? Is it yeah, it's autophagy, yeah. Autophagy. This is I heard this from my chiropractor that when you are cleansing, the intercellular water increases. Your intercellular water that is the toxins that are there will release your cells are able to, or new cells, but those cells are able to take in, and your extracellular water decreases. And that's when you're really both detoxing and losing weight, where intracellular water increases.
Okay. Not sure on that. The way I understand it is autophagy is a state where you're not using adipose tissue.
Okay.
And you're, in a sense, giving the body the space to clean house. You're basically getting rid of the zombie cells. And you're probably getting rid of some toxins. But again, nobody has studied it. Autolysis is where you're actually digesting the adipose tissue and cells in order to stay alive. And I've seen some things that say a male weighs 156 pounds can go 40 days before they start doing damage. Organs, muscle, so to speak. So,
Thank you. Have you ever used high doses of good milk thistle to detox? Milk thistle, yes.
Milk thistle. I typically after I fasted,
Okay.
then I would bring that in. But I think that there's kind of danger of adding things while you're fasting. Because the adipose tissue really does take care of it. The only problem.
Can you check the mic back? Can you use the mic there?
So you heard the question, right?
But not completely.
I'll repeat the question. It was about
Question about using good quality milk thistle. I have done that, and it has been very amazing.
Yeah, it is. Definitely. I just would not do it while I was on the water fast. When I finished the fast, then I would do it. And then, one of the things that I've seen in some of the literature I've read is that it's a bad idea to be adding supplements when you're fasting, because it really throws the body off. The adipose tissue apparently has what you need in order to stay alive. And that if you start adding supplements, it really muddies the waters. So just,
Well, I like your idea of using it after, because I just think your body can absorb it and work with it better.
right.
I think that would be why, like, as in, yeah, that makes sense to me.
I think that, again, if you're doing a water fast, you just want water. You can add things to enemas, but other stuff is not particularly helpful. It becomes then a modified food fast. When you begin adding things, even if you're adding herbs and adjusting the herbs.
I'm kind of wondering about the biosphere people, if they had had access to herbs in cleansing.
I don't think that they had a clue of what was going on.
Okay, yeah,
I think that they were like shocked
right.
because they were going like, we haven't been exposed to DDT in 20 years. What the heck? Why is our blood so? So when I want to make sure to do either things, this is a relatively recent book on fasting, and it's by journalists. So people that want a deeper dive in the sketchy history that I've shared with you tonight, I would recommend his book. And he also has experiences fasting in fasting clinics, the one in Northern California and the one in Germany. So I'm going to give people a minute to write it down or take pictures of it before I move on to the next. There's just two other books. Yeah.
I'm wondering if what would be. I'm wondering what the difference would be between like fasting and doing some sort of like gentle way to detoxify the body, like. Is there a particular benefit to fasting as opposed to trying to do it slowly in a different way?
Great question. I don't think that there's a search in that regard. But basically, if you eliminate the major sources of toxicity and you're religious about doing intermittent fasting, I do think that it's very helpful. But in order to get to a deeper level where you're getting rid of toxins your body might have stored for decades, you have to do the water fast. This naturopath, I think, is the best in terms of the basics of fasting. He also includes a fast that was developed by Johanna Brandt. That is a great fast. And again, it's a very powerful fast, but if you have candida, it's a difficult one to use because there is sugar in the grapes. And even though it's a small, tiny amount, when you're fasting, you would be amazed at the effect that just a tiny bit of any kind of food will have. And that one of the other things that I have found in my years of fasting is like how little the body actually needs. It's astounding how little the person needs to go. That goes back to old Luigi. That is.
You exercise like.
Do I exercise while I'm fasting? Great question. I did an experiment once where I said, this business about colonics and enemas is probably just fuck. How do I know it's real? So I said, okay, the first 3 days of this water fast, I'm not going to be done. By the third day, I could barely get out of bed. I had just severe fatigue, headache, body aches. And I said, well, now's the time to do an enema, see if it has any impact. So I did an enema, and then I went on a 10-mile bike ride. I had so much energy. And so it convinced me that colonics enemas are very helpful in assisting the body in ridding itself of toxins. But do I recommend it? Probably not. Because, you burn a lot of calories. And when you're fasting, the best thing to do is to do as little as possible and to make it as internal as you possibly can. The final book is this one here, Fasting, an Exceptional Human Experience. And this book is extremely comprehensive. These three books I find, just really essential to understanding more about what's involved in fasting.
I wanted to ask, do you take a multivitamin?
I do.
Okay.
Yeah, but it's a plant-based one. It's not synthetic.
I was gonna say, if I was thinking, had I not done a water fast, because I've still always taken at least my liquid.
But I don't take it when I fast.
Okay,
Yeah.
see, okay.
I don't take it when I fast because, I've read things where they try to use particular supplements, and what ended up happening is they didn't realize there were underlying conditions. And so the supplement kind of pushed people over the edge. I think when you've been on a water fast for a week or so, you begin to see that you're in a pretty sensitive state in terms of the ability to what you eat or don't eat and how that might affect you. Because, one of the things I do when I fast is I use ketone strips to kind of monitor kind of where I'm at. If I'm getting too much ketones, I might back off a little bit. But I found, for example, if I would have lemon water, it would have an amazing impact in terms of I would go from, let's say, a medium level of ketones down to slight. And then it would take hours to go back up. But I think at that level, you're in ketosis.
And this is using lemon balm?
No, I said lemon water. I had just a little bit of lemon water and I saw how drastically it affected my body's metabolism. Again, going back to the thing of the body's a pretty amazing and efficient machine. And I have in preparing this talk gone back many times to Luigi and thought, how did this guy survive on 12 ounces of food? And he started this diet when he was 40. Because eating too much food made him sick. And it's like, so it's very serendipitous in a way, but it's like, you see what 12 ounces of food is. And again, this is the vegetarian version, but that's not much to eat in a day. Even if you throw a little meat in there and some bread, still, it's not much. And then this part of it, again, apparently it worked for him. The 14 ounces of wine a day.
Do you think it was the new wine is just fermented grapes? Or fermented grape juice?
Well, in Italy, if you're in small towns, there's something called the vino locale, the local wine. And it's not fermented for as long a period of time. There are no additives because it's meant to be just used in that season. And I have a feeling that, he got local wine and he wasn't drinking. Because, again, I think that he talks about it as being a light version of wine. And whether that aided his digestion or not, I don't know. I mean, in current thinking, we think any kind of wine is deadly. Any kind of alcohol is deadly. And then when we look at the Mediterranean diet, people do tend to consume wine with their meals.
And you had the book that had the grape cleanse, and so.
Yeah, but that's not wine, that's grapes.
Right.
It's not fermented. And so, I've thought a lot about the Mediterranean diet. Perhaps this is a good way for me to close, because I've wondered why that diet is so effective, because it doesn't seem very different from the sorts of things that we eat. When I was in Italy, the thing that really surprised me was the difficulty in finding breakfast. I looked all over for breakfast. And unless I was in some kind of Airbnb where they have the European breakfast, It was like you went into a cafe and you had a stress like this and you left. And I thought, this is so weird. But then I realized that at noon, everything stops. Well, what do you do? And then people have large, the largest meal of the day is taken before 2 o'clock. And according to Michael Greger, if you do that, the body uses calories from that meal to digest the food. After 2 o'clock, according to Dr. Greger, the calories are stored. So I realized that the Mediterranean diet is intermittent fasting. Because people then return to work at 4 in the afternoon. They work till 8. They come home, they make dinner, they eat around 9 or 10 o'clock at night. That's why they're not really into breakfast. So I think that to me is the secret of the Mediterranean diet. And again, like I think that the thing of formation, everybody stops work, and the meal is very social, and all of that stuff just adds to healthy habits. Any more questions? Well, yeah.
Well, what do you think is the optimum length of a water fast?
That's a tough question. It's a tough question because you have to really look at the person's diet. Or you have to look at, does that person have some physical problem? Like in my case, I had a blood clot. I didn't want to be on blood thinners for most of my life. And so I had no real guidelines. And I did a whole series of fasts. And initially, none of them really seemed to impact until I did the really long fast. And when I did the long fast, I lived it. And, the doctors were saying to me, like, basically, you are a fool to think that you can stop Eliquis. You're going to be on this for the rest of your life. And I would say, but I don't have a clot disorder. And they would say to me, there are lots of people walking around with torticollis, like blood clots.
Yeah.
But I knew that if they looked more carefully at my history, they would have seen that, yeah, I had 2 surgeries for hernia, never through a clot. And you're 20 times more likely, if you have a clotting disorder, to throw a clot after surgery. So. And Dick Gregory was one of the people that said, he had experience where people got rid of blood clots by fasting. Now, again, if you have a clotting disorder, you have to be on the blood. But it didn't seem like there was anything in my history that would indicate that I had a clotting disorder. So that's what motivated me to continue experimenting with the length of the fast. And the one that I did for 17 days, I had to stop early because of another medical error. That I had developed a rash, and the doctor gave me antibiotics, and I foolishly took them. But I was having like a yeast style. That was a healing crisis, and I didn't recognize it as that. But I was fortunate enough to find a doctor that had some experience fasting. And he just said, I'm sorry about the antibiotics. Your bacterial, your infection was swollen.